later, but he was around.
Bob Kane and Stan Lee also.
Well, they were there, but they were after our time.
They were after you.
During, we all went away. Will never went to college, as far as I know. He started working almost immediately. And he had entrepreneurial bent, as those of you who worked with him know. I'm not surprised he was always on time because he was a businessman. One of his early ventures was he ran a book club, book and toy club sort of operation, where you went all over the world finding cheap toys for kids. And you'd get a toy a month with a little illustrated booklet with his drawings. I don't know whether anybody collected those or not. About Thailand or Burma or wherever, before it became Myanmar, or wherever. But he found he was very unhappy at the time he published a contract with Guard. I had a lot of conversation with him then because I've been book publishing all my career. And he was very unhappy about the reaction of publishers to what he was trying to do. And he eventually did his own self-publishing very successfully. Again, he was a businessman. And unlike many other authors who failed in this, he was quite successful. Incidentally, if I may correct you, the early graphic novel was a woodcut artist named Lynn Ward.
But he, we can argue about that later.
But Will knew his work.
Of course, I teach Lynn Ward in my graphic novel class.
There's another...
Franz Masriel.
And Joseph Moncure March.
Absolutely, yes. And Milt Gross did She Done Him Wrong. And so that's quite wonderful, yeah.
But there was a tradition before that. And people like, well, a guy who comes to mind, Mary's eldest father, Gilbert, who wrote a lot about Crazy Cat and the intellectual importance of Crazy Cat. And I think he published an edited version of Crazy Cat years and years ago.
Yeah, he wrote a book called The Seven Lively Arts.
Seven Lively Arts.
Which was made for in the History of Comics. Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything I can add.
Well, I'm sure there is, but let's get Danny. Danny, I know, how did you come to write the introduction to the first contract with God? Did you know Will? You must have known his work. Did you know him?
No, I remember seeing the Spirit when I was a little kid, 6 or 7, and it wasn't Superman and it wasn't Batman, and I didn't understand what it was, but it was interesting and kind of erotic sometimes, which was very upsetting to a Catholic kid. But after I got in comics, he did that great piece for the Herald Tribune, reviving the spirit of black and white in what became New York Magazine, edited by Clay Felker. And I thought that was an extraordinary piece of work. So a few weeks later, some friends knew that he was speaking near where I lived in Soho, and I accompanied them, and he and I kind of exchanged wisecracks about the relative merits of writers and artists. And then Gary Groth asked me to review a contract with God. I guess I saw pre-publication galleys or something, which I did, and then Will called me. And that, with about 3 words changed, that review became the intro to at least one of the publications of Contract with God. And then Will and I would run into each other and spend 5 minutes talking. And then I am, like a lot of writers, an introvert. I despise all of you. I don't want to. I want to be in a cave. And my wife is exactly the opposite. So it came to pass that Will.
She loves all of you.
She does, even the ones she hasn't met. Will never meet. But Will and I and Joe Duffy were doing a cable TV show, and the format was each of us had a 7-minute interview. So while I was on camera by myself, Mary Fran and Will were in the wings. When I came off camera, Will was coming to dinner. I had known him for like 8 years at that point and would never have thought to ask him to do. He's Will Eisner. I'm not going to ask the Holy Ghost down to have some dinner. But we had an extremely pleasant evening, and I guess an informative one. I mean, we had things to say, and we remained friends until he died. I had heard about his heart attack. I had had one about a year earlier. I sent him a letter and didn't get to it. He had died in the interim. It's a major loss to me, and certainly everything these guys have said about Will's contributions to this as an art form is true, and there's an awful lot more that could be said, and maybe.
And well, we got 2 hours. So. I'll speak on behalf of my generation, and so that would involve telling you how old I am, but you can figure it out if you do the math. In 1965, when Jules Pfeiffer's Great Comic Book Heroes came out, I was 12. Anyway, and that was the first anybody my age really had ever heard or seen of the Spirit. And I think from speaking to Pfeiffer and reading things he said, that was part of his intention in doing that book, was to reintroduce Eisner and the Spirit to the world. Because he'd sort of, Eisner had forgotten it and everybody else, but Pfeiffer had come in as Will's intern or very poorly paid assistant. And the story that Pfeiffer himself tells, that when I interviewed him last month at one of those Evo talks that he may have been at, he said Eisner looked at his art and basically told him he was lousy, but he was so intent on getting there to work for him somehow that he impressed Will because he knew every comic that Will had ever drawn or written or participated in his entire career. So Will had hired him as an assistant, but Pfeiffer really brought him back into the public eye, which I guess in some ways led him, the story goes, and Dave, maybe you can correct me, did I call you by your wrong name? Did I?
Carl.
Carl, I'm sorry, Carl. We just met today. I forget people's name, whoever this guy is. I seem to have known him for about 30 years. I think Will came to that legendary comic convention in New York in 70, 71, or 72. I've seen all 3 versions, where he first saw the comics of the underground guys, which is what inspired him to get back into the game. But I think it was probably the Pfeiffer book that put him back on people's radar, to begin with. Cut to I had met Will a few times. I met him when I worked for Byron Price in the mid-90s, and Will and Byron were doing some screensavers with the Spirit, and then I had kind of a memorable ride on the shuttle in San Diego between hotels where I got to chat with Will while we were traveling around. And then I ballyhooed him at the table. I was yelling, "Meet Will Eisner." I thought you really have to meet this big line, but I thought it would be funny. But my favorite thing, Chris was talking about how punctual Will was. I interviewed him for Right Now magazine back in 2003, and we'd made the appointment like a month or 2 before, and it was like 10 o'clock on March 23rd, whatever it was. And my experience with interviewing people was always, they'd cancel, they'd postpone, they'd forget about the appointment, they'd have an excuse why they, couldn't do it. I called up at 10:30 on March 23rd. "Hello, this is Will Eisner." And I was so impressed with that. It was like, okay, we made this appointment 2 months ago. I'm here now. I'm ready to do the interview. Let's go. And it's a great interview, if you get a chance to read it.
Well, Ken pointed out that Will didn't go to college, and I think that's a good way not to learn bad habits. I mean, if you go to, at least when I went and took creative writing, you were supposed to suffer. You were not supposed to be any kind of a businessman. They were antithetical. You hated the guys that went to CNF. And Will, I don't think, ever made those false distinctions between artist, writer, between what the world considered garbage art, i.e. comics, and